I have cleaned a great many rooms in my life, and most of them I could not tell you a single thing about now. They blur together the way water does. But there is one room I will carry until the day they fold my hands for the last time, and it was the smallest, meanest room in the whole of Marenhall. You would not have known Marenhall had a mean room in it. From the front it was all light. The embassy sat on a rise above the treaty city, and its great halls were cut from a pale marble that took the morning and gave it back doubled, so that even on a gray day the corridors glowed as though someone had lit a lamp behind the stone. The high windows ran from the floor to a ceiling I could not have reached with 3 ladders stacked together, and the dignitaries who came and went, human and dragon both, in those years after the long quarrel had finally been talked into something like peace, walked through that light as if they had earned it. Maybe they had. I had not earned it. I was paid to keep it clean, and there is a difference, and I have never minded the difference. A floor does not care who polished it. It only cares that someone did. My name is Myra Call. I was 52 the year I am telling you about, and I had been a housemaid for 31 of those years, the last 6 of them in the residence wing at Marenhall. I want you to understand what that wing was before I tell you the rest, because the size of the thing depends on the size of the place it happened in, and the residence wing was the place at Marenhall where the light did not reach. The public halls faced the city. The residence wing faced the slope behind, where the service yards were, and the laundry steamed, and the kitchens cut the air with smoke, and the staff who ran the embassy from the inside out did their living. It was a good wing. I am not telling you it was a hard life. I am only telling you it was a plain one, and that plain is where I have always lived, and that I had made my peace with plain a long time before any of this. The room I am talking about was at the very end of the residence wing, past the linen stores, past the old fitting room nobody used, down 3 steps into a stretch of corridor where the marble gave out and turned to honest worked stone. There was a door there that the staff called the ward, in the flat way you name a thing you do not want to think about too closely. Behind it lived a dragon. I should tell you what a dragon is, in case you have only the songs to go by, because the songs do them a disservice in both directions. They are not the monsters of the old stories, and they are not the gentle pets the new stories want them to be. They are their own thing entirely, and the first lesson of being near them is that you are near something that does not run on your clock or your reasons. A grown dragon of the great houses stands taller than a horse at the shoulder and longer than a wagon nose to tail, scaled the way a riverbed is scaled with stone, every plate fitted to the next, the whole of it moving like weather when they move. They have wings that fold along the spine like a closed fan and open like a sail, and claws on the forefeet that can take the bark off a tree in one draw, and a long neck, and a face that is all bone and intention with eyes set forward like a hunter's. They smell of hot metal and dry grass. When they breathe near you, you feel it in your chest before you hear it. They are not humanoid. I have heard people who never stood near one say the great dragons look like tall pale lords in robes. It is a lie. There is nothing of a man in them. They are wholly themselves, scaled and winged and old in a way that has no men in it at all, and the wonder of them is exactly that something so unlike us could ever come to care what we do. The one behind the door at the end of the wing was a child. A juvenile, the records called him, though to my eye he was a child, and I never once managed to think of him as anything else. He was small for his kind, the length of a large dog and the weight of one too, and where the grown dragons were the colors of bronze and slate and old gold, he was the gray of ash with a faint cold blue running under the gray, the way you sometimes see blue under the gray of a cooling coal. His scales had not hardened into plates yet. They were soft, the way a young thing is soft, and they slid under your palm like wet shingles. His wings were no bigger than my 2 hands spread, folded tight against him most of the time, and when he was frightened he pulled them in so close he seemed to fold himself smaller than he was. His eyes were the thing. His eyes were a clouded milk white, both of them with no light in them and no center, like 2 small moons gone over. He was blind. He had been born blind, I learned later, and among his people that was not a small thing. It was a marked thing. A fate thing. They did not kill him for it. I want to say that plainly, because I have heard worse stories and this was not one of them. But they did set him aside, the way you set aside a tool that has gone wrong in the making, not in cruelty exactly, but in a kind of grief that has hardened over into not looking. He had been sent to Marenhall as a ward, which is the polite word a great house uses when it sends a thing away to be forgotten somewhere clean. The dragon delegation kept him fed and watered and did not otherwise acknowledge he was there, and the human staff were told the same. Feed it, water it, leave it be. It is a ward of the Oran house and it is not your concern. The first time I saw him, I was not supposed to be there at all. A pipe had let go in the linen store, and the water had run down the corridor and under the ward door, and I went after it with my mop, because that is what I do. Water is my whole trade, and I pushed the door because the lock had swollen and given. And there in the corner of a bare stone room with a single high window and a pile of straw for a bed, was a small gray dragon with moons for eyes, pressed into the angle of the wall, shaking. He had heard the door. Of course he had heard the door. He heard everything I would come to learn. He lived by his ears the way I live by my eyes. He had turned his blind face toward the sound and pulled his wings in and gone so still that the shaking was the only thing moving on him, a fine tremor running all down his gray hide, and from his throat came a sound I have not got the words for. It was not a roar. It was the smallest sound a thing that size can make, a thin, keening note, the sound of something that has learned that the opening of a door means nothing good is coming, and has decided to be very, very quiet about being afraid. I have a granddaughter. I had 2 children of my own before that, both grown and gone to their own lives by then, and I had spent the best years of my arms carrying small, frightened things from one safe place to another, and there is a part of a person that those years do not switch off, that hears that thin keening note and crosses a room before the rest of you has decided anything. I crossed the room. I did not think about what he was. I thought about the note. I got down on my knees on the wet stone in front of him, a careful arm's length off, and I did the only thing I know to do with a frightened small thing, which is to make my voice low and slow and to keep it going, so that there is a thread of sound in the dark for them to hold to. "There now," I said. "There now, little one. It's only the door. Only an old woman and a mop and the whole pipe in the linen store gone to ruin. That's all the trouble there is in the world this morning. You hear me. I know you hear me. There now." He did not stop shaking, but the keening note changed. It came down half a step, the way a kettle does just before it stops, and his blind face turned a little more toward me, and I understood that he was doing with his ears what I would do with my eyes. He was looking at me. He was reading the room off the sound of my voice and the smell of me and the small wet noise of my knees on the stone, and somewhere in all that reading he had found something he could bear to turn toward. I stayed until the shaking eased. I never did get to the water that ran under the door that morning. It dried on its own and left a stain that is probably there yet. When I finally got up to go, slow so as not to startle him, he made the keening note again, lower now, and I knew it for what it was. It was the note a child makes when you turn to leave. "I'll come back," I told him. "I don't know that you understand a word of it, but I'll come back. I always come back. Ask anyone. Myra Call always comes back to a room that needs her." And I did. I told myself at first it was nothing, a stop on my rounds. I had the whole residence wing to keep, and one more room at the end of it would cost me 10 minutes a day, and no one would notice 10 minutes. That was the lie I told myself, and like most of the lies we tell ourselves, it was made mostly of true things. It did cost me 10 minutes. No one did notice, not for a long while. But it was never nothing, and I think I knew that the first morning I went back with a heel of bread in my apron pocket that I had no business taking from the kitchens, and pushed the swollen door and said into the dark, "It's Myra. It's only Myra. I told you I'd come." The keening did not start that time. That was the first gift he gave me, though I did not know to count it as one yet. The door opened, and he did not key up into fear, because he had learned the sound of the door and the sound of my feet and the sound of my voice, and had put them together into a thing that meant Myra, and Myra was not a thing to be afraid of. He lifted his head off the straw. The moons of his eyes turned to me, and his nostrils worked, taking the smell of the bread and under it the smell of me, and he made a different sound entirely, a low burring rattle deep in his chest that I came to know as well as I know my own breathing. It was the sound of a thing that is glad. I gave him the bread from the flat of my hand, the way you feed any beast you do not want to lose a finger to, and his mouth was hot and surprisingly careful, and his breath fogged my wrist. And while he ate I talked. I do not even remember what about. The weather, most likely, and the state of the linen, and the dignitary from the eastern reaches who had complained that his rooms smelled of soap, as if rooms were meant to smell of something better than soap. I talk the way you talk to anything that cannot answer, which is to say honestly, because there is no point performing for an audience that does not keep score. And he listened. He turned his blind face to follow my voice around the little room as I started, that first morning, to do what I could not help but do, which was to clean it. It was a filthy room. Not his doing, he was a clean creature by nature. He kept to one corner for his messes the way a good animal will, but the room itself had not been touched by anyone who cared in the whole time he had lived in it. There was old straw gone to rot under the new. There was a window so grimed that the one good thing the room had, a long fall of afternoon light, came through it brown and weak. There was dust in the corners thick enough to write your name in, so I cleaned it. I am a housemaid. It is what my hands do when I am thinking, and I had decided, somewhere between the bread and the burring sound in his chest, that this child was going to live in a clean room with a clear window, even if no one in the whole great house could be made to care that he lived at all. That is where it began, not with anything grand. With a mop and a heel of bread and a grimed window, I scrubbed clear so that the afternoon could get all the way in. I want to be careful here, because the easy way to tell this is to make myself out as something I was not. I was not brave. I was not kind in the way the stories mean kind, where a person looks at a suffering thing and resolves to save it and squares their shoulders and goes off to do good. I never once squared my shoulders. I just had 10 minutes and a frightened child at the end of my rounds, and I am the sort that cannot leave a thing alone that wants tending, and so I tended it, the way water finds the low place, not by deciding to, but by being what it is. If there is anything to admire in what I did, it is only that I kept doing it, and that I never once let myself believe it was beneath me, because nothing that needs doing is ever beneath the doing. I started calling him Moat. It came out of my mouth one afternoon without my planning it. I had been chasing the dust in his window light, watching the motes of it turn gold where the sun caught them, and I said, "Look at you, you great gray speck, sitting in my dust like one more mote come to settle." And the name stuck the way names do to a thing that has been waiting for one. Moat. He could not have known it was a small word, a humble word, a housemaid's word for the smallest thing the light can show you. But I think if he had known, he would not have minded. He answered to it inside a week, the burr in his chest when I said it, the turn of his head, and a thing that answers to a name is a thing that has been seen, and being seen was the whole of what that child had never had. The work of those first weeks was the work of teaching a blind child to live in his own room without fear. I did not set out to do it as a teacher would. I did it the way you do anything with a small thing, by repeating until the repeating becomes a road they can walk in the dark. Every morning I came at the same hour, and I knocked the door the same way, 2 and 1, before I opened it, so that the knock told him Myra before the door even moved. Every morning I crossed to the window first and opened it the same hand's width, so that he learned the sound of the catch and the smell of the outside air as the start of the day. I moved his water to the same place and his straw to the same place and his low stone trough where I put his meat to the same place, and I never moved them, because for a creature with moons for eyes the world is held together by where things are, and to move a thing is to take it away. And I talked, always I talked. He steered by my voice the way a boat steers by a light on a shore. If I went quiet, he grew anxious, his head casting back and forth, the keening starting up low in his throat. So I learned to keep a thread of it going whenever I was in the room, humming mostly, an old tune my own mother used to hum over the wash, nothing with words, just a low up and down that filled the room with "Where Myra Is." He learned the tune. After a while, when he was easy, he would burr along under it, a rough, rattling drone that found my note and sat just below it, and the two sounds together in that little stone room are a thing I would trade a year of my life to hear once more. He began to come to me. That was the change that told me something was happening that was bigger than 10 minutes. The first weeks he had stayed in his corner and let me come to him. But there came a morning when I knocked my 2-and-1 and opened the door, and he was not in the corner. He was halfway across the room, his blind face up, his soft wings half lifted with the strain of doing a brave thing, picking his way toward the door on his clawed feet with his long neck swinging side to side, reading the air for me. He had heard my knock and crossed his whole world in the dark to meet me at the door. When I said, "It's Myra, Moat, I'm here," he closed the last of the distance in a rush and put his hot, heavy head against my middle and stood there leaning, all his small weight given over, burring like a kettle, and I stood in that mean little doorway with a forgotten dragon child leaning his whole self against me, and I will not pretend I did not weep. I am not a weeper. I wept. It could not stay a secret, of course. A house has eyes the way a dragon has none, and what I was doing began to be noticed, and not everyone who noticed was glad. Sefton noticed first. Sefton ran the household staff at Marenhall, a dry, careful man who had given his whole life to the running of other people's houses, and had the particular sorrows of such a man, which are real sorrows even if the world does not weigh them heavily. He was not cruel. I want that on the record too, because it would be easier to tell you he was a villain, and he was not. He was a man with rules, and the rules existed to keep small people like us from being crushed between large powers like the great houses. And from where he stood, I was a small person breaking a rule that had been made to keep me safe. He caught me coming out of the ward one morning with the bread smell still on my apron, and he took me aside into the linen store, and he was quiet about it, which was worse than shouting would have been. "Myra," he said, "the ward is not on your rounds." "No, sir," I said, "it isn't. It is an Orun matter. The Orun do not wish the creature tended beyond its keep. That came from the delegation itself. Do you understand what it would mean for this house, for me, for you, if it got back to them that the staff were interfering with a ward of a great house?" "I understand it, sir," I said, and I did. I understood it completely. I'm not interfering with anything. I'm cleaning a dirty room and feeding a hungry child and humming over my work, same as I've done in every room of this wing for 6 years. If the great Orun house has a complaint about the standard of the cleaning, I'll hear it from the great Orun house. He looked at me a long moment. He was not a stupid man, and he knew what I was doing, and I think I have had years to think about it. I think some part of him was glad someone was doing it, even as the rest of him was terrified of what it might cost. "Be careful," was all he said in the end. "Be very careful, Myra. They are not like us. You do not know what notice from them means. It is not always a kindness." I told him I would be careful, and I was not even a little, because there is a kind of caring that does not leave room for being careful, and once it has hold of you, the only honest thing is to follow it where it goes. The harder part was not Sefton. The harder part was the day a dignitary saw the boy. It was a delegation from one of the dragon houses, not the Orun, a rival line I never learned which. They were all proud strangers to me, and they had been given the run of the residence wing for a function, and one of them, a great bronze creature with a collar of worked gold, came down the corridor where it had no need to be and found the ward door open, because I had it open to let the air through while I changed his straw. The bronze dragon filled the doorway. Moat, who had been dozing in his windowlight, came awake all at once at the wrong smell and the wrong weight in the air, and he did the old thing, the thing from the first morning. He pressed himself into the angle of the wall and pulled his wings in tight and began the thin keening note. And the bronze dragon looked at him for a long moment, and then made a sound I have never forgotten and hope never to hear again. It laughed. It was unmistakable, even across the gulf between their kind and ours. It was the low coughing huff of a thing that has seen something beneath its notice and is amused by the smallness of it. It said something in its own tongue to the others behind it, and they made the sound too, and the word in it that I could not understand I understood anyway, because contempt sounds the same in every language that has ever been spoken. And then it turned its great gold-collared head and looked at me, a human, a housemaid on my knees in the straw, and it huffed again, harder, as if I were the better joke of the two. I have been looked at like that before. Anyone who has spent a life in service has. You learn to let it run off you. It is part of the trade, and a person who cannot let it run off does not last in the work. I let it run off me. But I will tell you what I did not let run off, and it is the only thing in this whole account that I did with any thought beforehand, the only thing I chose. I did not let it touch the boy. I got up off my knees slow, between the bronze dragon and the corner where Moat shook, so that my old body was the thing in the child's air instead of the laughing thing in the door, and I put my hand on Moat's gray neck where he could feel it, and I started the humming. Just the humming, the old up-and-down wash tune, low and steady, into a room with a great contemptuous dragon laughing in the doorway. I did not look at the bronze creature. I gave it nothing. I looked at the floor and I hummed to the child, and I felt the shaking under my hand come down, half a step at a time, the way it always did, while the great house laughed in the door. And after a while, it could not have been long, though it felt long, the bronze dragon lost interest, because contempt that gets no answer has nowhere to go, and it took itself and its laughing companions off down the corridor to their function, and the air cleared, and Moat put his hot head against me and burred, and I went on humming until my voice gave out. I did not know then that the corridor had a fourth dragon in it that day, one who had not laughed. I did not know that the contempt of the bronze house and the steadiness of one housemaid had both been watched, from the shadow of the great stair, by a slate-tanned gold creature of the Oran delegation who had come down to that wing on no business at all. The way Moat had no business crossing his room, drawn by something it could not have named. I did not know his name was Darrow, or that he was Oran blood, or that he had been coming down to that wing more and more often in those weeks, standing at the turn of the corridor with his head bowed to listen, while a human housemaid hummed an old wash tune to a child his own house had set aside. I did not know any of it. I only knew that the boy stopped shaking, and that the great bronze fool went away unanswered, and that this is very often the most a person in my position can do, to be the thing that does not laugh, and to stand between. The months that followed were the best of my working life, and the strangest, because they were also the most ordinary. That is the part the stories never get right. They want the change to come in a thunderclap, but mostly the change came in the slow accumulation of small mornings, each one almost exactly like the last, each one carrying us both a little further into a thing we did not have a name for. Moat grew. His soft scales hardened toward plates, the ash-gray deepened and the cold blue under it spread until, in the afternoon light through his clean window, his whole hide ran with a faint blue fire when he moved, the way oil runs with color on water. His wings, which had been the size of my two hands, grew until they brushed both walls of his little room when he stretched them, and I understood that the room had become too small for him, that he was a creature meant for a great deal of sky, and was being kept in a stone box at the end of a service wing, and the wrongness of it sat in me like a stone of my own. So I began to take him out. It was against every rule there was, and I did it carefully in the early mornings before the house woke, leading him on a length of soft cord I made from old sheeting. Not to hold him, he would have followed my voice off the edge of the world, but so that the few staff who saw us would think I had him under management and not raise the alarm. I took him to the service yard behind the laundry, where the slope ran down to a stand of old trees and the sky opened up. And there, in the gray light before the sun, I let a blind dragon child learn what wind was. I will not forget the first morning the wind took his wings. He had them half open, casting for my voice as he always did, and a gust came up the slope off the city and got under them, and he staggered and nearly went over, and I thought he would key into fear. And instead he made a sound I had never heard from him, a high, clear, ringing note, nothing like the keening, the opposite of the keening, and he opened his wings the whole way and stood there in the wind with his blind face lifted, and the sound he made was joy. There is no other word. A blind child who had lived his whole life in a stone box discovered that the air would hold him up, and he sang about it into a gray dawn, with no one in the world to hear but a housemaid and the wind. He could not fly, not really, not yet. He was too young and the slope was no place to learn, but he learned the wind. He learned to lean into it and feel where it came from. He learned to steer by it the way he steered by my voice, and I came to see that this was how his whole life would have to be built, out of the things he could feel, wind and sound, and the warmth of the sun on one side of his face, into a map of a world he would never see. He was learning to slide through a darkness the rest of us never have to live in, and to find his way in it, and to do it without fear. And the thing that let him do it without fear was that he had learned in that mean little room that the darkness was not empty, that there was a voice in it that always came back. That is the only gift I ever gave him when I add it all up. I taught him the dark was not empty. Everything else he did himself. The cost came, as Sefton had warned me it would, though not in the shape he had feared. There came a gray, wet season when the Eastern dignitary, the one who thought rooms should smell of better than soap, made a formal complaint about the standard of the residence wing, and Sefton, who could not say the true reason a senior maid's rounds were running long, took the blame for it onto himself, and then, having taken it, had no choice but to set it down somewhere, and the somewhere was me. He did it gently. He always did things gently. He moved me off the residence wing entirely and put me on the public halls, the marble and the light and the high windows, a better posting by any measure the world would use, more pay and easier work and the dignity of the front of the house. And it meant I could no longer get to the end of the residence wing. It meant I could no longer get to moat. I will not dress up what I did. I went to Sefton in the linen store, the same linen store, and I asked him to undo it, and he could not, and I asked him again. And he could not, and the third time I asked him I was not asking. I was something nearer to begging. A 52-year-old woman with 31 years of service begging to be given the worst job back. And Sefton looked at me with a grief in his dry face that I think was partly for me and partly for himself, and partly for the whole arrangement of the world that made such a request necessary. And he said, "Myra, it is done. I cannot unmake it. If I move you back now, after the complaint, it is the both of us out the door, and then who feeds your boy?" And that was the first time he had called Moat my boy, and the kindness of it, buried inside the refusal, broke me a little. So I did the only thing left. I gave up my half-day. Once a week, every maid in service had a half-day to herself, the one stretch of time the work did not own, and most of us guarded it the way you guard the one warm thing in a cold house. I went to Junie, a younger maid who had the residence wing now, a good girl, warm-hearted and frightened of the rules in the way the young often are, and I told her the whole of it, and I asked her to let me take her rounds on my half-day so that I could reach the end of the wing once a week, and in exchange she could have my half-day's pay and an easier week besides. She wept when I told her about the boy. She had heard the keening sometimes, passing the door, and had not known what it was and had been afraid to look. And now that she knew, she said she would have done it for nothing. But I made her take the pay anyway, because a debt you do not pay is a weight you put on a young person's back, and I did not want her carrying mine. It was not enough. Once a week is not 10 minutes a day. The first half-day I reached the ward, Moat was so far gone into the old fear that he did not know my knock. I had been away 9 days, an eternity to a creature whose whole world was where things are, and he had decided, the way he had decided long ago, that an opening door meant nothing good was coming, and he was pressed into the angle of the wall keening when I came in. And when I said, "It's Myra, Moat, I'm here, I never left, I'd never leave," he did not believe me for a long, long while. I sat on the wet stone and hummed the wash tune until the light through his clean window had crossed the whole floor and started up the far wall, and only then did he come down off his fear. Only then did he cross his world to me and put his head against my middle, and the burr in his chest when it finally came had a roughness in it like a thing that has been crying. And I held his great gray head, and I told him over and over that the dark was not empty, that I was the voice in it, that I always came back, and I felt the worst I have ever felt in a long life of plain feelings, because I was telling a blind child a thing I could no longer make true. Once a week is not always. I knew it. I think he knew it. We sat in the lie together because it was all we had, and a shared lie that is made out of love is its own kind of true. That is how it stood me on the marble in the front of the house, reaching the dark end of the wing once a week, and finding him a little further into the old fear each time, the both of us losing a thing we could not afford to lose, one slow week at a time, when the Oran came. I did not see them arrive. No one warned the staff. You do not warn the dust that the great house is coming. I knew only that one morning the whole of Marenhall was different. A hush over it. The high public halls cleared of everyone but the most senior, the dragon delegations drawn up along the walls of the great receiving hall with their heads lowered, and a sense in the air like the pressure before weather. And then they came up the great stair, and I, polishing a length of marble balustrade where no one had told me to move from, saw the matriarch of the Oran for the first and only time. She was old the way mountains are old. Where Moat was the gray of ash, she was the gray of slate gone nearly to black with age, run through with veins of dull gold along the ridges of her spine and the great bones of her brow, and she moved slowly, with a terrible care, the way the very old and the very strong move when they have nothing left to prove to anyone. Her wings were folded and they were vast. Opened, I think they would have shadowed the whole of the receiving hall. Her eyes, and this is the thing that stopped my heart, leaning on my balustrade with my polishing cloth gone still in my hand. Her eyes were a clear deep gold, and they were grieving. I have seen grief in a great many faces, human and otherwise, and I knew it the moment I saw it in hers. The matriarch of the Oran had come to Marenhall carrying a grief as old and as heavy as she was, and I did not yet know it was the same grief I had been cleaning up after for the better part of a year. The delegations bowed as she passed. The senior staff pressed themselves to the walls. And I, who should have done the same, who had 31 years of knowing exactly how to make myself small and invisible in the presence of my betters, stood frozen at my balustrade with my cloth in my hand, because behind the old matriarch, in the train of great Oran dragons that followed her up the stair, walked the slate and gold one I would later know as Darrow. And as he passed me he turned his head, and he looked at me, Myra Call, the housemaid. And he did not look at me with contempt, and he did not look at me as if I were not there. He looked at me as if he knew me, as if he had been waiting a long time to put my face to the voice he had been listening to from the turn of a corridor for the better part of a year. I learned the rest in pieces afterward, some of it from Sefton, some of it from Darrow himself in the days that followed, and I will set it down for you in order though I did not learn it in order. The matriarch Sevruoran had outlived almost everyone. That was the heart of it. The great houses are long-lived past our understanding, and she had lived past her mate and past her brood and past nearly all of her descendants, and the line of the Oran, that ancient line, had come down at the last to a small handful, and then to fewer, until there came a season when the matriarch of the Oran realized that the only blood of her body still living in all the world was a single blind hatchling she had, in her grief and her pride and her old hard certainty about fate marks, allowed to be set aside and sent away to be forgotten somewhere clean. She had not been able to undo it. There are choices we make in the worst of our grief that harden over before we can take them back. until facing them at all takes more courage than most of us can find. The matriarch had let her last living blood be carried out the door, and then she had been too proud and too grieved and too afraid to call him home, and the years had gone by, and she had told herself that being kept was enough, that a fate-marked thing was better forgotten. All the things we tell ourselves when we have done a thing we cannot bear to look at. But she had not been able to look entirely away either, and so she had done a thing that great houses do, a thing I would never have guessed. She had sent watchers, not to bring him home, she could not yet face that, but only to know that he lived. Darrow was the last of them, the latest in a quiet line of Oran eyes that had come to Marenhall over the years on invented errands to stand at the turn of a corridor and listen, and carry back to the old matriarch the only thing she would let herself receive, which was the bare report that the ward of the Oran yet lived. And what Darrow had carried back in that last year was not what any of them had expected. He had come to report that the ward lived, and he had stayed to listen, and what he had heard and seen, the wash-tune in the clean room, the housemaid standing between the child and a bronze lord's laughter, a blind hatchling crossing his whole dark world to lean against an old woman without a tremor in him, a creature they had given up on learning the wind and singing about it. He had carried all of it home, not as a report now, but as something closer to an accusation. And an old grieving mountain of a creature had finally, at the very end of her long pride, found the courage that had failed her for years, and had risen, and had come herself to Marenhall to look at the things she had set aside. They found him, of course. It did not take them long. A great house knows the floor of its own embassy, and the matriarch went down through the marble, and the light to the place where the marble gave out, down the 3 steps, down the dark end of the wing to the door the staff called the ward, and the whole of the delegation and the whole of the senior staff, and because no power on this earth or any other could have kept me from following. One housemaid with a polishing cloth still clutched in her hand went down behind her. I will tell you what happened at that door, because I was there, close enough to see it, and because it is the thing I came to tell. The matriarch Sevrioran stood before the mean little door at the end of the service wing, the door behind which her last living blood had spent his whole life forgotten, and for a long moment she could not open it. I saw it. I who had opened that door 1,000 times with 2 knocks and one, saw the matriarch of an ancient house stand before it unable to lift the claw that would open it, because behind it was the proof of the worst thing she had ever done, and she had come all this way, and at the last her courage shook. And into that shaking, through the door, came a sound. It was the keening. Moat had heard the crowd, the wrong smells, the great weights in the air, all of it, and he had done the old thing. He had pressed himself into his corner and pulled in his wings and begun the thin, frightened note that meant nothing good is coming. And I could not bear it. I am only telling you the truth. I forgot entirely where I was and who stood in front of me. I stepped past the matriarch of the Oran, past her, around her, a housemaid shouldering past a creature that could have ended me with a thought, and I put my hand on the swollen door and I knocked it 2 and 1, and I said into the dark, in the same voice I had used 1,000 mornings, "It's Myra, Moat. It's only Myra. I'm here. I never left. I'd never leave you. There now, little one, there now." The keening stopped. It stopped the way it always stopped, all at once and then trailing, and through the door we all heard the soft scrabble of clawed feet on stone, and the long neck swinging, casting for the voice, and the door which had no business opening from the inside, but he had learned its weight. He had learned everything. The door pushed open under the press of a blind gray head, and Moat came out into the corridor into the middle of the greatest dragons of his line, and he did not go to any of them. Because he could not see them and did not know them, he came straight to me, the way water finds the low place, straight across the stone to put his hot, heavy head against my middle and lean his whole self into me, burring like a kettle, safe, home, found. And the matriarch of the Oran watched her last living blood walk past her, the matriarch of an ancient house, blind and unknowing, and choose a housemaid. I waited to be struck down. I'm not ashamed to say it. I stood in that corridor with a dragon child leaning on me and a ring of ancient powers around me, and I waited for the cost of having shouldered past the matriarch of the Oran, because Sefton had told me, notice from them is not always a kindness, and I had taken more than notice. I had taken the boy himself, in front of all of them, into my arms. The matriarch made a sound. It was low and long, and it came up from somewhere very deep in her, and I braced for I did not know what, and then I understood, the way I had understood the Bronze Lord's contempt across the gulf of language, that this sound was its opposite. The great old slate-and-gold creature, the matriarch of the Oran, the oldest and most powerful thing I have ever stood near or ever will, had lowered her vast head almost to the floor of the corridor, and the sound coming out of her was grief, the same grief I had seen in her gold eyes on the great stair, but loosed now, broken open, the sound of a thing that has carried a wrong for years and has at last been brought to the place where it can no longer not look, and has looked, and has seen its last living blood lean trusting and unafraid against the one creature in all the world who never once decided he was beneath the bothering. She did not take him from me. That is the thing I want you to understand, the thing that tells you what kind of creatures they truly are, under the pride and the fate marks and the long hard certainties. She could have. She was his blood and his house, and the law of the great lines was all on her side, and I was nothing, a housemaid with a cloth in her hand. She did not take him from me. She lowered her head to the floor and she grieved, and when she had grieved she spoke, and Darrow stepped forward to put her words into our tongue, in a low, careful voice, because she meant them for me to hear and understand. The Oran set this child aside, Darrow said, and you could hear in his voice that he was speaking her words and that the words cost her. The Oran named him fate-marked and let him be carried out into the dark, and the Oran told themselves the dark was empty and that the forgetting was a mercy. The Oran were wrong. He paused. The matriarch's great gold eye was on me the whole while. We did not feed his fear. We did not stand between him and the laughter of lesser houses. We did not teach him that the dark holds a voice that comes back. We did none of the things by which a creature is told that it is worth the keeping. A human did them. A human of no house and no name in our reckoning, who owed him nothing and gained nothing, and did them anyway every morning for the length of a year, asking for nothing in return. The matriarch made the low sound again, and Darrow waited for it, and then he said, "The Oran do not forget such a thing twice." And then the matriarch of the Oran did the thing that I have spent the rest of my life trying to deserve. She lifted her great head, and she looked at me with her grieving gold eyes, and she gave me a name. I will not pretend I understood it in the moment. It was a word in their tongue, and Darrow had to render it for me, turning it over a few times to find the nearest our language could hold. The nearest he came was Weimara, and the meaning of it, he said, was not easy to carry across, but it meant, as near as he could put it, the voice he steered by, the one whose voice the blind one followed out of the dark. It is a thing the Oran do, he told me later. They do not give names lightly, and they do not give them at all to those outside the blood, and to be named by the matriarch herself was a thing that had not happened in his lifetime or his father's. By the giving of it, he said, the house had claimed me, not as a servant and not as a guest and not as a friend, none of which are things their tongue even has a clean word for, but as kin. I might recall, 52 years a housemaid, was kin of the Oran, the oldest dragon house in the treaty worlds, by the word of the matriarch herself, witnessed by the whole delegation and the whole of the senior staff and one weeping young maid named Junie at the back of the crowd, and there is no power that can unmake such a naming, then or now or ever. I should tell you that I did not feel grand. I have heard people imagine that such a moment must feel like a door opening onto a great hall full of light. It did not. What I felt, standing there with Moat leaning on me and a name on me that I would never be worthy of, was something much smaller and much truer, and it was this: relief, pure relief, because the nomming meant they would not take him into the dark again. The nomming meant he was claimed and safe and home, and that the long hard certainty about fate marks had broken in the matriarch's old heart, and that whatever happened to me, whatever they made of me, the boy was through the worst of it. That is all I felt. A blind child was safe. The rest of it, the kinship, the name, the grandeur, I would have given the whole of it back gladly for that one thing, and I think the matriarch knew it, and I think it was the knowing that decided her. They took him home. Of course they took him home. A child belongs with his blood when his blood has remembered how to be his blood, and the Oran had remembered. But they did not take him from me, and that is the difference that the whole of this account has been bending toward. The matriarch ruled, and Darrow rendered it for me, careful as ever, that the ward of the Oran would return to the Homaries of his house as the matriarch's own get, last blood of the Oran, no longer set aside, and that the kin called Vaymara would have the freedom of the Oran for the rest of her days, would never want for anything the Oran could give, and would be, by the matriarch's word, the keeper of the boy's old name and the witness of his new life, for as long as she lived and after in the records of the house, forever. I went to the Homaries. I will not tell you much about them, because the truth is I remember very little of the grandeur of it and a great deal of small things. I remember that the Eyries were full of light, the Oran built high and open, all sky and stone, the very opposite of a closed room, and that the first thing the boy did when they set him down in his new home was lift his blind face and open his wings and find the wind and sing. I remember that the great dragons of the house, who had never bothered with him, came one by one in those first days to stand near him and learn the sound of him, the way he had learned the sound of me, and that he bore it well, a little wary at first and then easier, because I had taught him in the only lesson that ever mattered that the dark is not empty, and that the things that come out of it are not, in the main, things to fear. And I remember that on the third day, when the house had a feast for the return of its last blood, a grave, ancient, wordless sort of feast, nothing like our roaring human ones, the boy could not settle. He cast about the great open hall with his neck swinging, the keening starting low in his throat, frightened in the midst of his own honoring, and the great Oran fell silent and did not know what to do for him, because for all their power they had never learned the one thing about him that mattered, which was how to be the voice in his dark. And I, who was kin now and could go where I pleased, walked out into the middle of that grave assembly of ancient powers, an old human woman in a borrowed robe, and I began to hum the old wash tune, the low up and down that meant where Meyer is. And across the whole of that great bright hall the boy's head came round, and the keening stopped, and he came to me, the way he always came, and put his head against my middle, and burred, and under my humming in front of the whole assembled might of the Oran, the last blood of an ancient house found my note and sat just below it, the two sounds together, the way they had been in a mean little room at the end of a service wing a world away, and the great dragons watched, and not one of them laughed. I am old now, older than the matriarch was. No, that is not true. Nothing of us is ever as old as they are, but I am old by my own reckoning, and my arms have gone past the carrying of anything heavier than a teacup, and my eyes are not what they were, which the boy, when I tell him, finds very funny, in the grave dry way the Oran find things funny. I see him still. I am carried to the Eyries when I wish it, and he comes to Marenhall when I cannot make the journey, a grown dragon now, slate blue and terrible to look at and gentle as morning, and the children of the house come with him, and they have all of them learned the old wash tune, and there is no sweeter sound in any world than a clutch of young Oran dragons humming a human washerwoman's tune at the foot of an old maid's bed. People ask me, sometimes, the few who know the story, the ones Junie has told it to over the years, for she could never keep it, they ask me what it was that I did, as if there were a secret in it, as if a person had to be made of something rare to be claimed by a great house and given a name that means the voice he steered by. And I tell them the truth, which disappoints them every time because the truth is small. I did not do anything rare. I cleaned a dirty room. I fed a hungry child. I hummed over my work the way my mother hummed over hers, and I came back the next morning and the morning after that, and I never once let myself believe that any of it was beneath the doing. That is the whole of it. The great houses, for all their power and all their pride and all their long hard certainties, had forgotten the one thing that the lowest housemaid in the meanest wing of the brightest embassy never has the luxury of forgetting, that a thing that needs tending is owed the tending, and that you do not get to choose whether the thing that needs you is grand. You only get to choose whether you come back. I came back. That is all I ever did. I came back. There is one thing more, and then I am done. When they took the boy home to the Orun, and the ward at the end of the service wing stood empty at last, I did not let them seal it up, though they offered. I asked instead to keep it as it was, the clean window, the straw long since gone but the place of it remembered, the door that opens with 2 knocks and 1. And every morning that I am at Marenhall, old as I am, I walk down to the dark end of the residence wing where the marble gives out and turns to honest stone, and I open that door, and I leave it standing open the width of my hand, the way I always did, so the air can get through. There is no one in the room. There has been no one in it for years. But a creature once learned in that room that an opening door could mean that something good was coming, and that the dark held a voice that always came back. And I find that I cannot break the habit of leaving the way clear, in case some other small forgotten thing should ever come down to the end of the wing in the gray of the morning, casting about in the dark for a voice to steer by. I would want it to find the door open. I would want it to know that someone was coming. That is the whole of the story. I told you it was small.